I'm speaking with Mario Giannini, Executive Co-Chairman of Hamilton Lane. Mario, thank you for joining me for your INBrief interview. You gave a very engaging presentation at the Alternatives Symposium recently. Could you give us a précis on how private equity has evolved over the last 20 years and how Hamilton Lane sees the asset class today?
Well, I think the industry has grown enormously over the last 20 years. When I first started 30 years ago, but even 20 years ago, private equity was kind of this weird thing that people kind of knew about. Whereas now it's part of every corporate finance discussion and conversation, and it's part of every person's investment portfolio. I've said the biggest change in the last 20 years is 20 years ago, I would walk into a meeting and explain why private equity in a portfolio. Why did you need to invest in private equity? Now I walk in and it's not a why anymore. Everyone gets the why. It's a how much, what form, how do I do it? The why is now kind of an accepted part of having it in your portfolio.
Many people try to time their investment into private equity. How should we think about 2024 as a year to invest, or should we think more deeply about investing in this asset class?
Yeah, so the two biggest mistakes I always see in the private equity portfolios that we either inherit or that we look at, number one is people over diversify. That's a different issue. But number two is what you're talking about. People decide that this vintage year is going to be either a better or a worse one than the next vintage year, and so they either concentrate or move away from it. And I've never seen anyone do it well. Never. I may think 24 will be a great vintage year, or everything will be terrible. But here's what I'll tell you that works best. Whatever amount you want to invest, do it over a relatively consistent period of time. It's the only way to do it. There's no one I've ever met that is remotely close to determining whether a vintage year is actually going to be a good or a bad one.
We've also seen an increasing array of offers come into the market. What sort of guidelines would you encourage advisors and their clients to think about in terms of choosing private equity managers that suit their portfolios?
I would start the other way around. I think what you always hear, and I do it, you always sort of go, oh, this sounds interesting, or that person sounds really interesting. I think I'll invest with him or her. I'd start the other way. I would start with a top-down approach. What do you want from your portfolio, from your private equity portfolio? Do you want a lot of risk? Do you want safety? What do you want? And then work backwards from there to say, does this manager meet some of my criteria for what I want in a portfolio, whether diversified or single manager, whatever you're choosing? But I think too many times we tend to either fall in love or really dislike a personality, and that guides our investment decision. I would start much more strategically.
What kind of questions should advisors and investors ask managers that managers don't get asked very often?
Well, the one I don't get asked often enough, I get asked sometimes, but not often enough with probing around it, is what is your competitive edge? Why are you successful in the market compared to these 80 million other people that walk in my door? And then really probe on that. So I may say, well, I have a better track record than anyone. Well, is that relevant to what we're talking about going forward? Is track record the only thing that matters? Or how did you get your track record? Did you get it from the things you tell me are your competitive edge? I think that's the part that is often missing. We fall in love with track record. We fall in love with the story. And we don't do enough analysis of why are you better or worse than somebody else that walks in the door?
And finally, Mario, what issues do you see potentially emerging in private equity over the next, say, 2 to 3 years? For example, are you expecting IPO markets to open a bit further? Are there certain categories around which you'd be more cautious or ones that you'd be more optimistic about? And what issues do you see arising and why?
No, I think the big question is going to remain interest rates. I suspect that that's going to dominate the discussion over the next 2 or 3 years. Which way are interest rates going, and how does that determine how we're going to invest? Because if interest rates move much higher, then it changes, obviously, the investment landscape and your expected future rate of return. And if they move lower, if we go back to a zero interest rate environment or close to it, which no one expects, that has some real repercussions around the portfolio. So to me, there will be things that happen that change the markets, an election here, and we're in the US, so that's a big deal. And what will that do? But I think those will be shorter term impacts. I believe interest rates and the direction of those rates over the next couple of years will be the big factor in how we're all going to succeed or fail in our investment objectives.
Mario, thank you very much for your insights. That was most helpful, and hopefully we'll see you again at another Inside Network event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.